The tracking page popped up with a small orange warning: route under review due to corridor risk. And by the afternoon, my delivery's ETA had quietly slipped. The ship, carrying a simple order, a few SD cards, and a reference book, was being rerouted the long way to avoid a tense strait. It wasn't urgent, but it felt strange to see a single risk insurance decision bend an ocean route and nudge my neatly planned weekend. That small delay led me to today's episode, where we look at the world's maritime choke points: Suez, Bab el Mandeb, Hormuz, Panama, and others that keep global trade moving. We'll explore how narrow sea lanes, security risks, and climate constraints can send insurance rates soaring, reroute ships halfway around the world, and ripple through delivery times, supply chains, and prices. From the economics of freight and fuel to the geopolitics of patrols and canal limits, this is the story of how the world sails around its narrowest places and what it costs to keep goods flowing. Welcome as you're listening to Thread by Thread, a podcast where each episode unravels a new thread, connecting stories of power, people, and the forces shaping our world. I'm Dheeraj Kumar. To understand why that small orange icon on my tracking page could bend a route across half the planet, you have to start with geography and then follow the money. Maritime choke points aren't just narrow waterways, they're economic pressure valves that can release or contain the flow of global commerce. When these passages tighten, close, or become dangerous, the entire arithmetic of international trade changes. Insurance rates, fuel costs, timing, inventory strategies, and ultimately the prices we pay for goods. Let's map the world's critical maritime bottlenecks. The Strait of Hormuz, barely 29 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, nearly 30% of all global oil trade. Most of that crude, about 70%, flows to Asian markets, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea as the primary destinations. For perspective, that's approximately $600 billion worth of oil annually passing through a channel you could swim across in about an hour. The Suez Canal presents a different constraint, not width, but geopolitics and economics combined. Before the Red Sea crisis erupted in late 2023, the canal generated about $9.4 billion annually for Egypt, with over 26,000 ship transits in 2023 alone. But by 2024, that number had collapsed to roughly 13,200 transits, a devastating 50% drop, as major shipping lines rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope to avoid Houthi attacks. Egypt's canal revenue plummeted by 62.6% in the first 11 months of 2024, translating to about $6 billion in lost income. The Strait of Malacca tells the story of pure volume and dependency. Stretching 900 kilometers between Malaysia and Indonesia, it narrows to just 1.5 nautical miles at Phillips Channel, creating one of the world's most congested maritime highways. About 84,000 vessels transit annually, carrying $3.5 trillion worth of goods, roughly one-third of all global trade. For China alone, this strait handles two-thirds of its maritime trade volume and 80% of its oil imports, representing about 60% of the country's entire oil supply. Japan routes 40% of its maritime trade through these waters, making it as economically vital as any domestic port. The Panama Canal operates under entirely different physics, freshwater scarcity rather than geopolitical risk. Each ship transit consumes over 50 million gallons of fresh water from Gatun Lake to lift vessels 85 feet above sea level. When drought struck in 2024, daily transits dropped from normal levels of 36 to 40 ships to as low as 22, with strict draft restrictions forcing large vessels to carry reduced cargo loads. The math was brutal. Roughly 100 million tons of cargo, about 35% of the canal's normal annual volume, faced delays, higher costs, or complete rerouting. War risk insurance serves as the financial barometer of maritime choke point stability, and its pricing reveals the true cost of geopolitical uncertainty. In normal times, transiting the Red Sea might cost a vessel 0.05% of its hull value in additional war risk coverage, essentially background noise on most shipping budgets. But when attacks escalate, those numbers transform with shocking speed. By mid 2024, Red Sea war risk premiums had jumped to 0.3 to 0.5% of hull value per transit, with temporary spikes reaching 1 to 2% during peak threat periods. To put this in concrete terms, a $100 million container ship that once paid $50,000 in routine war risk coverage now faced $300,000 to $500,000 per voyage, sometimes climbing to $1 to $2 million during crisis peaks for a shipping line operating dozens of vessels on tight margins. These aren't just line items, they're strategic decisions that can determine whether a route remains commercially viable. The Persian Gulf demonstrates how quickly war risk mathematics can change regional trade flows. Premiums there doubled in 2025, climbing from roughly 0.2 to 0.3% to about 0.5% of hull value. A typical very large crude carrier, VLCC, worth $90 million, now faces up to $450,000 in additional war risk premiums for a 7-day transit through Hormuz. When you multiply that across the roughly 20 million barrels per day flowing through the strait, the aggregate premium becomes a significant component of delivered oil prices. These aren't academic calculations, they are live quotes that shipping companies receive with 24 to 48-hour expiration windows. A captain approaching the Red Sea might receive 3 different premium quotes in a single day, each reflecting the latest intelligence assessments and incident reports. The decision to pay the premium or divert around the Cape of Good Hope often comes down to spreadsheet calculations made in real time, with fuel costs, schedule commitments, and inventory obligations weighed against volatile insurance rates. When ships reroute to avoid dangerous or constrained choke points, they pay a compound penalty in distance, time, fuel, and capacity absorption that ripples through the entire shipping network. A vessel diverted from the Suez Canal around the Cape of Good Hope adds roughly 3,500 nautical miles and 10 to 14 days to its journey, but the economic impact extends far beyond simple distance calculations. UNCTAD's 2024 analysis revealed that Red Sea disruptions forced container ships to increase sailing speeds by approximately 25%, from typical 16 knots to 20 knots, to meet existing delivery schedules despite longer routes. The speed increase tripled bunker fuel consumption per nautical mile, dramatically raising operating costs while simultaneously reducing the number of rotations each vessel could complete annually. The result was a perfect storm: higher costs per voyage and reduced fleet utilization. By mid-2024, the demand for additional container ship capacity had increased by about 12% just to accommodate these longer routes and higher fuel consumption. Ships that would normally complete multiple rotations per year found themselves locked into extended voyages, absorbing global capacity and tightening available tonnage for new bookings. This created a cascading effect. Longer routes required more ships. More ships meant higher demand for berths at alternative ports, and higher port demand translated into congestion and additional delays. The numbers became visible in port statistics. By June 2024, container vessel capacity equivalent to 2.5 million TEU, representing 8.4% of global container capacity, was sitting at anchorages rather than moving cargo. This wasn't just inefficiency, it was capacity effectively removed from the global shipping fleet, creating artificial scarcity that drove freight rates higher across all routes, not just those directly affected by choke point disruptions. The Panama Canal demonstrates how physical constraints can create economic bottlenecks as severe as any geopolitical crisis. The canal's freshwater dependency creates a zero-sum game during drought conditions. Preserve water by restricting transits, or risk the lake levels that make any transits possible. During the 2024 drought, the Panama Canal Authority implemented a complex rationing system. Daily transit slots were auctioned to the highest bidders, with priority passage fees reaching $2.85 million for a single transit, more than 10 times the normal toll. Ships unable or unwilling to pay these premiums faced delays of 2 to 3 weeks or were forced to lighten their cargo loads to meet draft restrictions. Draft limits dropped from normal 50 feet to as low as 44 feet for Neo-Panamax vessels, forcing them to carry 12 to 15% less cargo per transit. The economic ripple effects were immediate and measurable. McKinsey estimated that container shipping costs on Pacific routes increased by 20 to 25% during peak restrictions. Retailers adjusted inventory strategies, moving from just in time delivery to building larger safety stock buffers. Agricultural exporters faced particular challenges as seasonal products couldn't wait for water levels to recover or justify the premium transit fees. Alternative routing added its own costs. Ships diverted from Panama to the Suez Canal faced the same Red Sea war risk premiums we discussed earlier. Those choosing to round Cape Horn added roughly 8,000 nautical miles and 2 weeks to Pacific Atlantic transits, fundamentally altering the economics of trans-Pacific trade and making some marginal routes commercially unviable. Maritime choke point disruptions don't remain confined to shipping company balance sheets. They flow through freight rate markets and eventually reach consumer prices through well-established transmission mechanisms. UNCTAD's Shanghai Containerized Freight Index provides a real-time window into how choke point constraints translate into shipping costs. The index averaged 2,130 points in January 2024, more than double its December 2023 level, as Red Sea and Panama disruptions converged. By May 2024, it had spiked to approximately 2,644 points, driven by rate increases, peak season demand, EU emissions trading costs, Panama Canal tolls, and elevated war risk premiums all hitting simultaneously. These weren't gradual adjustments, they were shock increases that reshaped shipping economics within weeks. The pass-through was visible across specific trade routes. Asia Pacific to Europe rates saw record weekly spikes of $500 per container in late December 2023. Trans-Pacific routes doubled from December 2023 to January 2024, reaching $8,103 per 40-foot container on West Coast routes and $9,945 on East Coast routes by July, the highest levels since the COVID-19 pandemic. Even routes that didn't directly traverse affected choke points saw increases as global capacity tightened and alternative routing created artificial demand pressure. UNCTAD projects that sustained freight rate increases from Red Sea and Panama disruptions could raise global consumer price levels by 0.6% by the end of 2025. That projection assumes the combined impact, 157 percentage points contributed to container freight increases and 33 points to dry bulk rates, persists over the forecast period. For context, that's roughly equivalent to a modest central bank interest rate increase, but delivered through supply chain disruption rather than monetary policy. The transmission mechanism works through multiple channels. Direct pass-through occurs when importers face higher freight bills and adjust retail prices accordingly. Indirect effects include inventory financing costs, as companies build larger safety stock buffers, warehouse capacity constraints as firms stockpile against future disruptions, and supplier diversification costs as businesses develop multiple sourcing options to avoid choke point dependencies. Faced with longer transit times, unpredictable schedules, and volatile freight rates, companies have fundamentally restructured their inventory strategies, embedding additional costs throughout global supply chains. These adjustments represent a shift from efficiency-optimized logistics toward resilience-focused supply chain management, with measurable impacts on working capital, warehouse utilization, and financial planning. Longer sailing times directly extend cash conversion cycles. Goods that once traveled from Asian factories to European retailers in 30 days now take 45 plus days via Cape routing, keeping capital tied up for 50% longer periods. For companies operating on thin margins with high inventory turns, this extension requires either additional financing or reduced throughput, both of which increase the effective cost of goods sold. Safety stock levels have increased across industries vulnerable to choke point disruptions. Retailers report building inventory buffers equivalent to 2 to 4 weeks of additional sales to absorb potential route delays. Automotive companies, heavily dependent on just-in-time delivery, have established regional parts distribution centers to reduce dependency on single shipping corridors. These buffers require additional warehouse space, inventory financing, insurance coverage, and management systems, costs that ultimately flow through to consumer pricing. The financial impact becomes visible in corporate working capital metrics. Companies with high import content report 15 to 25% increases in inventory carrying costs since choke point disruptions began. This includes not just the direct costs of additional stock, but also warehouse lease premiums, as demand for logistics facilities has increased. Higher insurance coverage for larger inventory values, and opportunity costs of capital tied up in safety stock rather than productive investments. What struck me about my delayed parcel wasn't the inconvenience, it was recognizing the economic triage happening behind that simple rerouting decision. Somewhere in a Rotterdam dispatch center, operations coordinators were weighing war escorts that expire in 24 hours against fuel costs for a longer route. Port agents were rebalancing berth allocations and trucking schedules. CFOs were calculating whether to hedge bunker fuel prices or accept spot market exposure on extended voyages. This triage occurs thousands of times daily across global shipping networks. Each decision represents a micro optimization within constrained parameters: insurance availability and pricing, fuel costs and hedging opportunities, port congestion and slot availability, customer service commitments and penalty clauses, fleet utilization and rotation efficiency. When multiplied across the entire maritime industry, these individual decisions aggregate into the macro phenomena we observe: freight rate volatility, route diversification, inventory buffer building, and ultimately, consumer price impacts. The economics of choke points have evolved from periodic disruption risks into permanent cost factors embedded throughout global supply chains. War risk insurance, once a minor line item, now represents a significant variable cost that can determine route viability on short notice. Alternative routing options, once emergency measures, have become standard contingency plans requiring dedicated capacity and financial reserves. Inventory management, once optimized for efficiency, now must balance just-in-time delivery against just-in-case supply security. Uncatad characterizes current global trade as exhibiting resilience under pressure, commerce that continues flowing despite repeated shocks, but at higher cost and with thicker buffers. This resilience comes with what we might call a resilience premium, the additional costs that companies and consumers pay for supply chains that can absorb choke point disruptions without complete breakdown. The premium manifests in multiple ways: higher baseline freight rates that incorporate choke point risk, increased insurance costs across all maritime routes, not just high-risk ones, expanded warehouse and logistics infrastructure to support larger inventory buffers, diversified supplier networks that trade efficiency for security, and financial reserves maintained to handle route disruptions and premium spikes. For my delayed parcel and millions like it, this premium was invisible but real. The war risk advisory that triggered the rerouting represented a system that had learned to price uncertainty, hedge against disruption, and maintain goods flows even when preferred routes became dangerous or unavailable. The cost of this learning appears in freight rates, insurance premiums, inventory policies, and ultimately in the prices of goods on shelves. The narrow straits and canals that once made global trade efficient have become economic variable costs, priced daily and passed through to balance sheets, shipping schedules, and consumer prices. They have transformed from geographic advantages into financial instruments, liquid assets whose value fluctuates with geopolitical stability, climate conditions, and the complex mathematics of risk assessment. In today's economy, the price of keeping goods moving includes not just the cost of transportation, but the premium for navigating an increasingly uncertain world through its narrowest places. Maritime choke points aren't just geographic features that can be mapped and measured, they are battlegrounds for the future of global power. The economics we've explored, insurance premia, rerouting costs, inventory buffers, represent just the surface tension of deeper geopolitical currents. What's happening beneath is a fundamental reshaping of how nations project influence, how alliances form and fracture, and how economic leverage transforms into strategic control. The question isn't whether countries will compete for these narrow passages, it's how that competition will define the world our children inherit. The transformation of choke points from economic bottlenecks into strategic weapons represents one of the most significant shifts in contemporary geopolitics. Unlike traditional military assets that require massive investment and visible deployment, choke points offer what strategists call asymmetric leverage, the ability to influence global commerce through control of small geographic areas that happen to sit astride vital trade routes. China's approach to the South China Sea illustrates this evolution perfectly. Beijing's strategy isn't primarily about the sea itself, it's about conditioning Southeast Asian states to accept subordinate status through repeated demonstrations of control. Every artificial island built, every fishing fleet deployed, every administrative boundary drawn serves to normalize Chinese dominance over waters that carry one third of global trade. The goal isn't conquest in any traditional sense, it's the gradual redefinition of sovereignty itself, where international law bends to the reality of power projection. This conditioning works because choke points create dependency relationships that can be manipulated without direct confrontation. When Chinese Coast Guard vessels shadow Philippine supply missions to Second Thomas Shoal, they're not just asserting territorial claims, they're teaching Manila that access to its own waters depends on Beijing's tolerance. Multiply this lesson across the region, and you get what Chinese strategists call winning without fighting, the achievement of strategic objectives through economic pressure rather than military conquest. What we are witnessing is the emergence of a maritime Cold War, where choke points serve as the primary theaters of competition. Unlike the terrestrial Cold War, which divided continents along ideological lines, this contest plays out in narrow straits and shipping lanes where the rules of engagement remain deliberately ambiguous. The United States has begun to recognize this shift, though perhaps later than it should have. The Trump administration's approach represents a fundamental departure from decades of treating global shipping as a market driven, politically neutral force. The Federal Maritime Commission's investigation into foreign control of choke points signals a new willingness to treat shipping infrastructure as strategic assets rather than commercial conveniences. When Washington begins examining whether foreign governments are weaponizing maritime choke points, it's acknowledging that the era of depoliticized global trade is ending. Russia and Iran understand this dynamic intuitively. Moscow's control over energy choke points in the Arctic and Black Sea regions provides leverage far beyond its conventional military capabilities. Tehran's ability to threaten closure of the Strait of Hormuz, through which one-fifth of global oil flows, gives it geopolitical weight that its economy alone could never support. These aren't abstract threats, they are demonstrated capabilities that shape diplomatic calculations from Washington to Beijing to Brussels. Perhaps the most profound long-term factor reshaping choke point geopolitics is climate change, not as an environmental issue, but as a geopolitical multiplier that will create new passages while making existing ones more vulnerable. The Arctic presents the clearest example of how melting ice transforms strategic geography. Current projections suggest that Polar Class 7 ships, vessels with moderate ice strengthening, will be able to transit Arctic routes year-round by 2065, potentially reshaping global trade patterns as dramatically as the opening of the Suez Canal did in 1869. The northern sea route alone could reduce transit times between Asia and Europe by up to 40%, offering an alternative to the Suez Canal that bypasses many of the Middle East's traditional choke points entirely. But this opening comes with its own geopolitical implications. Russia controls the infrastructure and regulatory framework governing Arctic shipping, giving Moscow potential leverage over any nation seeking to use these routes commercially. China has already declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in Arctic shipping capabilities, setting up a potential competition for influence in waters that could become as strategically important as the South China Sea. The irony is profound. Climate change, driven partly by the carbon emissions from global shipping, may ultimately provide shipping with alternatives to the choke points that currently constrain it. Yet these new routes will likely be controlled by the same great powers that are competing for influence over existing passages. potentially concentrating rather than distributing choke point leverage. Understanding choke point geopolitics requires thinking in decades rather than quarters, which creates a fundamental mismatch with how most democracies approach strategic planning. Authoritarian systems possess what we might call strategic patience, the ability to pursue long term objectives without the pressure of electoral cycles or shareholder returns. China's Belt and Road Initiative exemplifies this approach. By financing port infrastructure from Djibouti to Piraeus to Colombo, Beijing isn't just seeking commercial returns, it's building what strategists call a string of pearls that could provide leverage over maritime choke points throughout the Indian Ocean. These investments may not pay off financially for decades, but they create optionality that could prove invaluable in future crises. The challenge for democratic societies is developing institutional frameworks that can sustain multi decade strategies despite changing governments and shifting public priorities. The European Union's concept of strategic autonomy represents one attempt to address this challenge using economic integration to build collective resilience against choke point manipulation. The EU's decision to exclude Chinese companies from major medical device procurement and China's mirror response demonstrates how this competition extends far beyond traditional military domains. Looking forward, we can envision several scenarios for how choke point competition might evolve, each with different implications for global trade, alliance structures, and the possibility of sustained conflict. The first scenario is what we might call managed competition, a world where major powers establish tacit rules of engagement around choke points, maintaining competition below the threshold of direct military confrontation. This would require developing new forms of maritime diplomacy, perhaps including international mechanisms for sharing choke point access during crises and agreed upon escalation ladders that allow fish saving retreats from brinkmanship. Such a system might involve conditional access agreements where nations guarantee passage rights in exchange for reciprocal commitments elsewhere. It could include international monitoring systems that provide early warning of choke point manipulation and coordinated responses that make such manipulation prohibitively expensive for the perpetrator. The second scenario is spheres of influence, a more dangerous world where choke points become exclusive domains of competing great powers. Under this model, China might achieve effective control over South China Sea passages, Russia over Arctic routes, Iran over the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States over the Panama Canal. Global trade would fragment into regional blocs, with cross-block commerce subject to political interference and economic weaponization. This scenario would likely accelerate the trend toward friendshoring and supply chain diversification, but it would also embed enormous inefficiencies into the global economy. The resilience premium we discussed earlier would become a permanent feature of international commerce, with trade patterns determined more by geopolitical alignment than economic efficiency. The third scenario is technological bypass, a future where new technologies and climate change combine to reduce the strategic importance of current choke points. Arctic shipping routes, autonomous vessels capable of longer alternative routes, and massive improvements in overland transport infrastructure could all contribute to making choke points less central to global commerce. Yet, even in this scenario, the transition period would likely see intensified competition for control of existing passages while new ones emerge. The geopolitical dynamics might shift from controlling fixed choke points to managing dynamic shipping networks, where route options change based on weather, political tensions, and technological capabilities. Choke point competition is already reshaping alliance structures in ways that will define international relations for decades to come. Traditional alliances based on shared values or historical ties are being supplemented and sometimes superseded by partnerships based on shared vulnerabilities to choke point manipulation. The Quad partnership between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia represents this evolution. While officially focused on promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific, the Quad's underlying logic is ensuring that no single power can control the maritime choke points that connect the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Japan's dependence on energy imports through the Strait of Hormuz